Good morning, good afternoon everyone. We are delighted to have so many people connected to this webinar on the FDA-EMA Parallel Scientific Advice Program. My name is Anabela Marçal and I'm the EMA Liaison Official to the FDA. Before going to my own presentation, I would like to remind everyone on the objectives of this webinar. We will provide an overview of the Parallel Scientific Advice Program. Participants will gain a general understanding, including how to submit a PSA request, the expected procedure timelines, and outcomes. We'll also present the findings from a 5-year PSA program review, and we expect you will be able to gain some insights into the PSA process by reviewing 2 case studies. Finally, we expect you'll have a better understanding of best practice recommendations for those considering a PSA request. Moving now to my own presentation, I'll start this webinar by setting up the scene and giving some information on the basic principles of the EMA FDA Parallel Scientific Advice Program. During my presentation, I will explain what is parallel scientific advice. I'll provide an overview of the EMA-FDA collaboration during this process, the main steps of the procedure, and what is required from companies in terms of submission interactions with authorities during the procedure. Let's start then by explaining what is parallel scientific advice. The goal of the PSA program is to provide a mechanism for EMA assessors and FDA reviewers to concurrently exchange with sponsors their views on scientific issues during the development phase of new medicinal products. We expect that such interactions increase dialogue between the 2 agencies and sponsors from the beginning of the life cycle of a new product. In turn, these may provide a deeper understanding of the basis of regulatory decisions, optimize product development, and avoid unnecessary testing replication or unnecessary diverse testing methodologies. All the exchanges between the EMA and FDA during the PSA procedure are conducted under the existing confidentiality arrangements. What are the best candidates for PSA? From experience, we have found that the best candidates for PSA include important medicinal products, such as those for unmet medical needs, and especially those being developed for indications lacking development guidelines, or, if guidelines exist, those for which EMA and FDA guidelines differ significantly. In addition, we can also think about biosimilars, products with significant clinical safety, animal toxicology, or manufacturing concerns that could impede further product development are also very good candidates for PSA. In a nutshell, and before I go into further detail in the PSA process, I just would like to highlight some of the main features of the PSA procedure. This is a voluntary procedure. It's totally the decision of the sponsor, and it started at the request of the sponsor. Questions on product development are put both to EMA and FDA, the same questions. Scientific advice can be provided on any scientific question, preclinical, clinical, quality. Advice can be asked only for a specific part of the development. During the procedures, there are discussions between EMA and FDA, and there will be opportunity for a joint discussion with the sponsor as well. At the end of the procedure, the agencies issue their own responses to sponsors' questions in line with the usual procedures. So, as a sponsor, I've submitted a PSA request. Will it be granted? It depends. A PSA request does not guarantee the PSA procedure will be granted. For various reasons, one or both agencies may decline to participate in such a procedure. For example, the scientific questions being asked are outside the legal remit of the agency, or it's too early in the development of the product, and other reasons. Some of these reasons will be explored in a next presentation by one of the other speakers. What if the request is not granted? If the request is not granted, the sponsor can still pursue a scientific advice procedure with each agency individually, or then going for consultative advice, meaning that will submit a scientific advice request to one agency, but experts from the other agency will be invited to participate in the discussions. In this slide, we have a high-level overview of the collaboration between EMA and FDA during a PSA procedure. The four main parts of PSA are shown here. First, a review of scientific questions that are submitted in the sponsor's meeting package. Both agencies receive the same questions and background materials and will review it individually. As a second step, the FDA and the EMA hold a bilateral review meeting. During this meeting, the reviewers and assessors discuss deficiencies, outstanding questions, review issues, and share opinions. Next, a trilateral meeting is held between the sponsor and both agencies. This meeting allows for joint discussions between each of the relevant parties. And finally, written formal feedback is provided individually by each agency to the sponsor. The feedback is shared not only with the sponsor but also with the other agency in the form of FDA meeting minutes or EMA final scientific advice letter. Detailed information on the timelines for the PSA procedure will be provided by the next speaker. However, I just would like to highlight that the overall process for PSA, time-wise, is aligned with the CHMP scientific advice procedure and timeline for Type B meeting at FDA. Here is a visual representation of what may be considered a traditional method of seeking feedback from the agencies. One customized set of questions and background materials is submitted to FDA. After FDA reviews and corresponds with the sponsor, FDA issues its advice. Similarly, when seeking feedback from EMA, the sponsor submits a customized set of questions and background materials. EMA reviews and issues its own advice. At this point in time, it is very likely that the sponsor has received two different advices from the two agencies to what may have been very similar scientific questions. As a result, it is possible that the sponsor may have to duplicate or replicate similar studies in order to meet expectations of each agency. Unlike the traditional method, PSA allows for collaboration and alignment between EMA and FDA. With PSA, the same materials are submitted to both agencies. Next, a bilateral meeting is held where the agencies review each other's draft advice, meaning the FDA's preliminary comments and EMA list of issues. This meeting provides an opportunity for identifying areas for harmonization or divergence. Then the trilateral meeting is held between the sponsor and both agencies, where the sponsor prepares a presentation based on the preliminary comments from FDA and list of issues from EMA. This is an opportunity for the sponsor to clarify their understanding of the advice, and if the agencies were not able to provide convergent advice, for the sponsor to better understand the reason why. Between 10 and 30 days following the trilateral meeting, the agencies complete and share their formal written scientific advice with both the sponsor and the other agency. In general, it is anticipated that PSA allows for more convergence of advice compared to the independent advice request method. However, it should be noted that PSA does not guarantee convergence of advice. As stated in the General Principles document, both agencies will strive for convergence, but that's not a guarantee. pretty much the takeaway from this slide is that the PSA process promotes collaboration between EMA and FDA through aligned information and direct concurrent interaction, which may lead to harmonization and convergence of advice. You might be wondering by now what a PSA submission consists of. As a sponsor, what will you need to submit to the agencies as part of a PSA request? The first step is a request sent to both agencies. This request is intended to be brief, 1 3-page document, and includes information on the product in development, why a discussion with both FDA and EMA would be beneficial, specific questions requiring clarification, desired goals for the meeting, and authorization for the agency's exchange of all information relevant to the product. If both agencies grant a PSA request, the sponsor will then receive an email from each agency acknowledging agreement and indicating the primary contact person at each agency. Next, the sponsor prepares a meeting package containing scientific questions and any relevant background and development information. EMA takes the meeting package through its validation process, and once the package is validated, then the sponsor sends the final meeting package to both FDA and EMA. During the review, the FDA reviewers and the EMA assessors occasionally may submit information requests to address deficiencies or clarify ambiguities. Sponsors are also asked to submit slides for the trilateral meeting that address the list of issues from the EMA and the preliminary comments from FDA in an integrated presentation. And finally, during the trilateral meeting, the sponsor will draft meeting minutes and send a copy to the EMA. The FDA will draft its own meeting minutes. Further information on the detailed timelines to provide all these different packages will be provided by the next speaker. To wrap up, from what I have presented, I think you already got your answer to this question. Why PSA? Why should I, as a sponsor, submit a request for PSA? It's an opportunity for engagement with both regulatory agencies. It avoids duplication of work. There will be common approach wherever feasible or a better understanding of the reasons for potential remaining divergences. And it's an opportunity to simultaneously solicit and receive official feedback. For further information, please refer to the PSA Principles document, which is published on the website of both agencies, and you can find the links here. Thank you very much for your attention. And now I would like to introduce the next speaker, Shannon Thor from FDA, who is going to present a 5-year review of PSA program. Over to you, Shannon.
Thank you, Anabela, and hello, everyone. Thanks for attending this webinar. My name is Shannon Thor, and I'm an International Policy Analyst in FDA's Europe office, where I manage the PSA program for FDA. Today, I'll be talking about the results of a 5-year review of the PSA program and also doing some myth-busting regarding the PSA timeline. EMA and FDA have conducted a 5-year review of our PSA cases from 2017 through 2021. In doing this review, we wanted to look at how many and what kind of PSA requests have come in during that time frame. Here you can see our total numbers for requests and a breakdown of what has been accepted, withdrawn, and completed cases. Of the 37 total, we accepted 26 of the requests, or 70%. We denied 11 requests, and I'll speak a little later in a future slide about the reasons we might deny a PSA request. But even when we accept, there are times when the sponsor chooses not to proceed with submitting a meeting package. This happened 4 times over the 5-year period, leaving us with 22 completed procedures in the 5 years. Here's a look at our procedures by year, with the number of requests in orange and the number of accepted requests in blue. So not a lot of trends to see here, but notably, we did have a high number of requests and acceptances in 2020 and 2021. These might seem like small numbers, but each procedure requires a significant commitment of time and resources from both agencies. In this slide, you can see another breakdown of the accepted requests by category, with gastroenterology, rare diseases, and medical genetics at the highest category at 23%. Anti-infectives and oncology are each at 15% each. And there's also a strong showing for cardiorenal and neurology products. Some of the other category of products included one-offs in rheumatology, dermatology, diabetes, and ophthalmology. And overall, I'd like to note as well that many of the products were for pediatric indications, for rare diseases, and which makes sense based on what Anabela described as the best candidates for the PSA program. So unmet medical needs, small populations, or lack of available guidelines. As I mentioned earlier, we denied 11 requests for PSA over the 5-year period, and this chart shows the distribution of reasons for the denials. 4 of the 11 denials involved products that had a medical device component. As you might be aware, Europe and FDA have significantly different regulatory frameworks for evaluating devices, which in the past had led to denials of some PSA requests. Though I will note that recently, EMA has been granted some new authorities over device development. And in fact, one of the 2021 accepted PSA procedures was for a product with a device component. So with this in mind, we do not want to discourage developers from pursuing a PSA because of these data. Another reason for denials is when the product in question is at a significantly different stage of review at each agency. You can probably imagine that it would be difficult to hold discussions when reviewers are at very different points in their process. And this is especially the case when we have seen a PSA applicant who has not had previous interactions with FDA via the IND or pre-IND pathways before. The other 3 denials involve circumstances where one or both agencies felt that PSA was not a good option for other more varied or nuanced reasons. So now that you understand the number and the types of requests that we generally receive, I'll move into the myth-busting area of my talk. We've seen that the uptake of the PSA pathway has been limited, and typically companies pursue advice from each agency independently, often in series, even though, as Anabela mentioned, the independent advice approach requires expending resources on preparing for 2 separate meetings, 2 separate meeting packages, where the scientific questions can often be nearly identical. When discussing PSA at a recent public workshop on expedited programs and regulatory harmonization, industry participants noted that the PSA process is not well understood by sponsors, especially the expected timelines of PSA procedures. Common rumors or myths about PSA are that, number 1, PSA takes too long, and number 2, that the timelines are unpredictable. We wanted to know if these were just rumors, or if not, what we could do about it. So after hearing this feedback, we took a look at our published PSA timeline, which is shown here. And I recognize that this is a complicated chart with lots of arrows and colors and words. So point taken, thank you for your feedback, and we have revised this and we'll be posting an updated timeline shortly, which I'll show you in an upcoming slide. But before we threw this graphic in the trash, we wanted to see how accurate it was at describing how long each step of the PSA process should take. These numbers were our benchmarks, so we decided to see if our actual PSA timelines match up with it. So we pulled records from EMA's databases for a cohort analysis of the 7 PSA procedures from the calendar year 2020. We mapped out their timelines to see how long does it take the agencies to accept an informal request, how long from the request acceptance date to EMA's validation of the meeting package, And finally, how long from the validation of the meeting package to the company receiving EMA's final advice letter. So let's take a look at myth number 1, PSA takes too long. The 2020 cohort showed an average turnaround time of acceptance of informal requests of 13 calendar days. While our timeline had no formal benchmarks for the agency's review of the informal request, we hope that an average of 13 calendar days for the routing, review, and decision on a PSA request seems an agreeable timeframe to our stakeholders. And in fact, this turnaround time is quite a bit shorter than the 21 days allowed for a response to CDER's Type B meeting requests. After the validation of the meeting package, the timelines of the 2020 cohort quite strictly followed the Scientific Advice Working Party, or SOP, meeting schedule, with an average time from the validation of the meeting package to EMA's final advice letter of 79 days. Now, I will flag that there is a known outlier for the SOP schedule, and that is the August SOP holiday. So if you're considering a procedure start in the summer months, the timeline will extend an extra 30 days. But that is a known and can be planned for by a company. And for an FDA comparison of this metric, for CDER Type B meetings, the expectation from meeting granted letter to advice can be up to 90 days. So in terms of myth number 1 of PSA taking too long, we feel like PSA takes around the same amount of time as expected of a Type B meeting standard. So we feel like this myth is busted. So what about the predictability of the timeline? The 2020 cohort actually showed that the published PSA timeline is highly predictable once the meeting package has been validated. PSA will follow the SOP timeframes, only being interrupted from the standard 75-day timeline if the PSA takes place over the August SOP holiday. But in looking at the 2020 cohort, there was variability during the validation phase, or more specifically, the date from the acceptance of the PSA request to the validation of the meeting package. On average, this took 67 days, whereas our published timeline budgeted only up to 45 days for this phase. This phase is when the applicant has the greatest control of the timeline. The validation phase may be quite swift if the applicant quickly submits a robust meeting package after their informal request is accepted. And it may be longer if the applicant requests a pre-submission meeting with EMA, or if they submit a deficient meeting package, or there could be strategic reasons that the company may want to delay the submission of their draft package. So for myth number 2, we feel this myth is perhaps partially busted. The PSA timelines are predictable once the meeting package is validated. However, the applicant has a great deal of control over the length of the validation phase of PSA, and this is where there is the most variability in the timeline. So now I'm showing you the brand new updated PSA timeline, which I hope is much simpler to understand than previous versions. You can see here that companies can submit their informal requests at any time. As Anabela mentioned, you submit an email explaining your product and why you think it would benefit from a PSA procedure. We typically will either accept or deny your request within a couple of weeks, and if we accept, you'll begin drafting your meeting package, and the next step is for you to submit that draft package to EMA. It can take up to 45 days or so for the validation of the draft package, and the length of that time can depend on the company's choices, such as whether they pursue a preparatory meeting and the overall quality of their draft package. But once the package is validated, marked here as day 0, the PSA is on a predictable timeline based on the SOP schedule. Around day 15 to 25, each agency will hold internal discussions. Then, around day 30 to 34, the agencies exchange their draft preliminary comments and list of issues in advance of the day 35 bilateral meeting. After this meeting, agencies will send the preliminary comments and list of issues to the sponsor. Then the trilateral meeting is held around day 65. Finally, EMA will send its final advice letter within 10 days of the trilateral, and FDA will send its meeting minutes within 30 days. So I'm wrapping up my part of the webinar. I hope you've learned about the types of PSA requests we've seen in recent years, and that I've helped bust some myths and corrected some misconceptions about PSA timelines. I'd like to turn it over now to Thorsten, who is going to take you through a couple of case studies to really show you what the PSA experience is like. Thorsten, over to you.
Many thanks, Shannon. My name is Thorsten Vetter, Scientific Officer at the European Medicines Agency in the Office of Scientific Advice, and I'm the topic lead for PSA. I would now like to share with you two anonymized cases of PSA, providing information on the Parallel Scientific Advice request letter and identify elements which support Parallel Scientific Advice acceptance. I would like to show you topics raised for discussion, discuss the procedural flow. For case 1, I will share with you some sponsor feedback we have received, and I will illustrate the involvement of the EMA committees and working parties and patients for case 2. The first case concerns a small molecule immunomodulator intended for treatment of inflammatory bowel disease. PSA was requested on change of a previously agreed pediatric development program. The PSA request letter clearly described the challenges to be addressed, namely to agree a suitable evidence generation strategy in this rare subpopulation, as the sponsor was unable to recruit sufficient adolescent patients in the phase 3 study. The development had been discussed previously with both FDA and EMA, including an agreed EMA pediatric investigational plan and an FDA initial pediatric study plan. The expected benefits of PSA mentioned by the sponsors were to facilitate a globally harmonized approach to evidence generation in the pediatric population, and to facilitate necessary amendments to agreed PIP and IPSPs with EMA and FDA respectively. Of note, a new extrapolation-based proposal had been informally discussed with FDA and EMA pediatric experts, and their preliminary views were divergent. So there was a clear objective for PSA, namely to have a trilateral discussion on a pediatric development program which could be acceptable to FDA and EMA in an area of unmet medical need. The questions to both agencies focused on the design of a new phase 2-3 safety, efficacy, PK and PD study in the pediatric population, specifically on the study population, the age cohorts, the endpoints, the sample size, the analysis plan, and the safety monitoring plans. A FDA-only question was included on the envisaged amendment of the IPSP, and an EMA-only question was included on the envisaged overall pediatric evidence generation plan to support benefit risk assessment in the EU at the time of marketing authorization application. Now a short summary of the procedural flow. First, looking at the period from PSA acceptance to the formal start of the procedure. FDA and EMA independently reviewed the PSA request, and acceptance was communicated to the sponsor after 10 days. The sponsor immediately communicated envisaged procedural timelines. This is critical information for planning and could ideally already be mentioned in the PSA request letter. FDA and EMA procedural leads swiftly convened a preparatory call and agreed on procedural timelines, including scheduling of bilateral and trilateral trilateral meetings. 6 weeks after PSA acceptance, the draft package based on the EMA scientific advice briefing document template was submitted for EMA validation review. No preparatory meeting was requested. An addition of a preparatory meeting would add 3 weeks to the validation period at EMA. But this is usually only recommended for sponsors with either limited experience in terms of drafting briefing information or if the request is very complex. 10 weeks after PSA acceptance, the briefing package was validated by the EMA and submitted to FDA at the same time, and the procedure formally started. Now looking at the period from the start of the procedure to the trilateral meeting. The published PSA timelines as per the general principles following the published EMA Scientific Advice Working Party meeting schedule were met throughout. FDA and EMA experts discussed the proposal in a bilateral meeting 5 weeks after procedure start based on an exchange of preliminary written views. EMA provided the list of issues including a preliminary scientific discussion 2 weeks before the trilateral meeting. FDA shared preliminary answers with the sponsor 1 week before the trilateral meeting. The sponsor considered the preliminary feedback from both agencies and integrated it into a trilateral meeting presentation as well as providing written answers to all issues raised. The trilateral meeting was held 8 weeks after start of the procedure. It is important to note that it is the sponsor who is driving the trilateral meeting by integrating and prioritizing issues raised by both agencies into a single meeting presentation to make best use of the 90-minute meeting. After the trilateral meeting, FDA and EMA have a 30-minute debriefing discussion, allowing for clarifications and reflection on options to align remaining divergencies. The sponsor provided meeting minutes 4 days after the trilateral meeting. Then, both agencies followed their processes to finalize the advice. For EMA, the meeting content was rediscussed at the Scientific Advice Working Party to agree on the final advice to be provided. The EMA final advice letter was shared with the sponsor 10 weeks after the start of the procedure. So the time from PSA request acceptance to the final letter was 20 weeks. The final advice letters are exchanged between the agencies after adoption for information. As part of a recent joint public DIA workshop presentation, we received feedback from the sponsor of this PSA procedure. These were the benefits mentioned by the sponsor. The preparation of a single meeting package had saved time and resource. There was a significantly faster alignment achieved on a complex pediatric study design for a multinational pediatric clinical trial. It took 5 to 6 months from PSA request to receipt of final advice from both agencies, which is similar to the time usually needed for consulting with only one agency. The PSA process did facilitate a detailed understanding of FDA and EMA positions. The final study design proposed at the trilateral meeting met the expectations of both agencies. The following challenges were mentioned by the sponsor. First, the careful preparation required to make best use of the 90-minute trilateral meeting. It can be challenging to discuss all topics. Prioritization is needed. It is advisable to provide written answers to all issues raised by both agencies prior to the meeting. Separate preliminary comments from FDA and EMA were received at different time points, and no consolidated feedback. There is limited time, approximately 1 week, to prepare the slide presentation. The sponsor expressed preference to either receive FDA and EMA consolidated feedback or separate feedback, but at a similar time point as early as possible. It was emphasized that detailed work on trilateral meeting presentation and written answers is key to a successful meeting. Overall, the sponsor indicated that PSA had been very helpful in gaining alignment from both agencies expeditiously when a significant change to the previously agreed clinical pediatric strategy was proposed. PSA did allow for detailed understanding of FDA and EMA thinking. For EMA and FDA experts, PSA did work well and allowed for agreement in principle on an evidence generation strategy in a rare pediatric population. The PSA provided a basis for further separate discussions between both agencies and the sponsor on a detailed protocol. The challenges mentioned by the sponsor with a view to receiving separate sets of preliminary feedback at different time points are acknowledged and may be considered for future process improvement. However, receiving separate preliminary feedback from FDA and EMA may also facilitate a clear and nuanced understanding of each agency's position when preparing for the trilateral meeting. Now turning to the second case. This concerned a gene therapy medicinal product, an ATMP, consisting of hematopoietic stem and progenitor cells transduced ex vivo by a gene-carrying lentiviral vector for the treatment of an enzyme deficiency syndrome. This product had an orphan designation in the US and the EU. PSA was requested on all areas of development, namely CMC, non-clinical and clinical, in an ultra-rare population, with a focus on CMC requirements and the design of a single pivotal clinical study. The aim was to ensure regulatory alignment from US and EU in time before initiation of a single pivotal trial. The earlier development had been discussed previously with both FDA and EMA, and the sponsor informally explored PSA options with both agencies before submitting the PSA request letter. In the PSA request letter, the sponsor recognized the high number of questions for discussion and suggested handling of the CMC questions in writing only. The PSA request letter also clearly indicated the questions addressed to both FDA and EMA, and very few questions to either agency addressing region-specific considerations. The envisaged procedural timelines were mentioned, which facilitated efficient procedural planning. Now looking at the questions raised for discussion. CMC questions concerned the drug substance manufacturing, the comparability assessment for a new manufacturing process, batch analysis and stability data for lentiviral vector use, product release specifications, and the potency assay. Further, one question concerned the overall non-clinical strategy. Finally, the focus of the request was on the design of a single pivotal phase 3 study. The single-arm design, the use of historic controls, the definition of the study population, the definition of primary and secondary efficacy endpoints, the composition of a historical comparator cohort, and the statistical analysis plan. 2 EMA-specific questions were raised, namely the suitability of the envisaged evidence generation to demonstrate significant benefit in the context of the EU orphan regulation, and on the acceptability of the envisaged pediatric development plan. One FDA-specific question related to considerations on eligibility for rare pediatric disease product application. Input from multiple EMA working parties and committees was successfully integrated for advice on this orphan pediatric ATMP development. From the Scientific Advice Working Party, SAWP, as procedure lead, from the Committee for Advanced Therapy Medicinal Products, CAT, which is concerned with ATMP authorization, from the Pediatric Committee, PDCO, which decides on pediatric investigational plans, from the Committee for Orphan Medicinal Products, COMP, to consider whether the proposed study may generate appropriate evidence to demonstrate significant benefit at the time of marketing authorization application. From the Biologics Working Party, or BWP, for all CMC aspects. And from the Committee of Medicinal Products for Human Use, CHMP, who adopts the final advice letter and will be the final arbiter on benefit risk at the time of application for marketing authorization. Last but not least, 2 patient representatives provided valuable input and supported the discussion during the trilateral meeting. Notably, this was the first parallel scientific advice to discuss ATMP-related CMC aspects. The applicant contacted EMA and FDA informally before the PSA request, whether CMC questions could be included. While not a requirement, this step is helpful in case CMC topics are planned to be included. The option was considered during an ATMP cluster meeting and was welcomed by CMC experts from both agencies. During the PSA procedure, CMC aspects were discussed in a separate meeting between FDA and EMA experts in parallel to the main bilateral meeting, which focused on non-clinical and clinical issues. There was overall good agreement on CMC aspects between the agencies. CMC questions could be included for discussion at the trilateral meeting, but this was not required for this parallel scientific advice. CMC experts from both agencies considered the discussion very helpful and would welcome future opportunities to discuss CMC aspects of complex products and ATMPs as part of formal PSA procedures. Conclude. Parallel scientific advice is a useful and efficient way to align complex global development programs, in particular for innovative products in areas with lacking or diverging regulatory guidance, or for products targeting challenging populations. Informal conversations with FDA and EMA contact points or the international offices at both agencies can be helpful to prepare a PSA request. The PSA General Principle document provides all the necessary information for efficient planning. The published timelines are met. This we have confirmed in our 5 years analysis, which will be published soon. The increasing number of PSA procedures recently suggests an increasing appreciation of this platform by sponsors as well as EMA and FDA experts. With this, many thanks for your attention, and over to Sandra Cuda, who will explore some best practices for PSA.
Hi everyone, my name is Sandra Queter. I'm the Deputy Director of FDA's Europe office, and I'm the last formal speaker in this session. We've shared a lot of information so far, and I hope you're enjoying the presentations. I'm going to review a few highlights to wrap things up after 2 challenge questions, and then we're going to move to some best practices that we've gotten together and developed to help you think about PSA and whether it applies to you, and if you think that it does, some hints to help you make it a good experience. So let's press challenge question 1. When EMA and FDA consider whether to grant a PSA request, they consider which of the following factors? A, the public health benefit of the product. B, the likely cost of the product being developed. C, the potential for the product to address unmet medical need. D, how easy the product is to manufacture. E, A and C above, or F, all of the above. We'll give you a few seconds to think about this. The answer is A and C. We consider the public health benefit of the product as well as its potential to address an unmet medical need. Question number 2. What percentage of all PSA requests from 2016 to 2020 were accepted by both agencies? 25%, 42%, 58%, or 70%? The answer is 70%. So let's move on to a little bit of a review of some of the highlights of the previous speakers, starting by thinking about Anabela Marçal's introduction to PSA. I hope you'll carry with you the opportunities that entering into a PSA procedure might bring. Remember, it is not the norm for FDA and EMA to discuss product development programs in advance. Historically, too, we have experienced that sponsors tend to visit one agency before the other, and sometimes what happens is that they carry a message about the other agency's views to the second agency. And oftentimes, those views are not very accurately captured, and this can often create confusion. So our experience is that a PSA, while intensive, provides a mechanism to bring EMA and FDA to the table without that confusion to work with you on your challenging global development plan at the same time. It's your opportunity to understand right up front how aligned the two agencies are in their views, and if they're not, to really understand why. What a PSA is not is a guarantee that the two agencies will align on every point. It's also not a substitute for sound scientific planning on your part or on the part of your consultants. Good planning, as I'll emphasize over and over again, is probably one of the most important aspects of a successful parallel scientific advice process. And importantly, PSA isn't the end of your opportunities to get advice from either of our agencies. We both have mechanisms to provide advice to companies one-on-one. So even if you do take advantage of PSA, you still can come back for further discussions. Myths do abound when it comes to parallel scientific advice. Many of them surround how long it takes. In fact, the amount of time that it takes for a PSA procedure is very similar to that for advice for getting advice from an individual agency. And most of the variability in the timelines from one PSA procedure to another depends on the applicant and how long it takes between that initial inquiry for a PSA and the production of a sound briefing book that is reviewed and validated by the agencies. Once the process itself is underway, you'll be able to predict very readily when you're going to have your scientific advice. Thorsten Vetter shared some excellent examples of PSA procedures that we've undertaken in recent years. I've been involved with every PSA procedure since 2016. And I can tell you that prepared sponsors who do their work up front have the best experience. They bring to the table data that backs up their proposals. They set up discussions that seek to foster true engagement and meaningful discourse. And they're prepared to expand their thinking on their development program. Similarly, prepared agencies have good experience by bringing forth to the discussion informed and thoughtful experts and having worked through some of their own internal differences within agencies ahead of the meeting. In fact, I would say by and large, for the vast majority of PSA procedures are considered highly rewarding by sponsors, EMA, and FDA. So on to best practices. First, timing matters. A parallel scientific advice procedure should not be your first discussion with FDA on development. As for any advice procedure from FDA, prior discussions about a pre-IND or having submitted an IND is really valuable because it allows the PSA procedure itself to focus on global development instead of the FDA becoming familiar with some of the preclinical work that's going into your product development. Also, when it comes to timing, factor in the calendar. Agencies' timelines are generally very reliable, and so you should expect about 2 weeks for us to reply to a formal request that you submit. But we do remind you that there are, agency-specific times when staff are almost always less available. For instance, the August recess of the Scientific Advice Working Party. If you submit a PSA request in July, there may be a delay longer than usual if you submitted it in September, for instance. Second, when it comes, we really advise you to have looked ahead and look at FDA and EMA guidances that would be relevant to your product. If there is already alignment on particular development pathway, say for a particular disease, a PSA procedure is probably not needed. It's not going to add any value to your planning. We would say that the best candidates for PSA are those for which there is not much prior guidance, and those tend to be innovative products, those with, bringing to the table new science or novel regulatory concepts. Third, make the case for public health value. That really is going to be the agency's fundamental interest in deciding whether to grant a PSA in the first place. As a review again, we're most interested in products that address an unmet medical need to provide added value in the public health arena. These might be things like rare diseases, really innovative products, treatments where you're the first option on the block or there's only one other option available, other special populations like pediatrics or pregnant women. But explain your product's potential, why you think it has that potential, and be as specific as you can be. The fourth category of best practices really falls into some what I consider true pragmatics, and it comes down to the briefing materials or your playbook that the agencies are going to review. A single briefing book that's provided to both agencies is essential. The last thing you want is for the regulators to be talking together and learn someone has information that the other does not. To avoid that, we recommend you follow the CHMP scientific advice template. that you also, in your briefing package, be clear on your priorities for what you really want us to address. Not everything except the kitchen sink. Think through the issues and options, and then be candid about your plans. Sometimes there may be aspects of a particular question that is specific to one agency. Be sure to flag what those are. And on our final point on best practices surrounds the trilateral meeting. Prepare well. It's really the key. Use the preliminary feedback that you got from both agencies to prioritize what you want to talk about. You're responsible for organizing that meeting in a way that there will be good discussion and that brings you to the point you feel like you need to be to close out the procedure. We recommend that in thinking about that meeting, you prepare your whole team. It's 90 minutes of time that you have with both agencies to present your case, reflect on the feedback that they have given you, and foster really good, meaningful discussion. Be transparent about your plans, be open-minded, and get the most that you can out of the procedure. So with that, I think it's time to close our formal presentations and turn this webinar over to you for your questions. With that, let's go forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you all for the great presentations. We'll now transition into our Q&A session. If you haven't had a chance to enter your questions into the Q&A chat pod, please do so now. We'll answer as many questions as time allows. And while our panelists are coming on using their video, we'll also remind you about that March the 30th deadline, so please remember to beat the deadline and fill out those surveys and attest to your attendance if you're a healthcare provider. All right, looks like 3 out of 4 panelists are on video, so we'll go ahead and start our round of questions. And the first group of questions will be directed to Anabela Marçal. And here's the first question. Could PSA form be used for all products? And if not, could you please clarify the criteria?
Hi everyone. Yes, so we got a number of questions in terms of the scope of parallel scientific advice with regards to products. So all type of products are welcome. So ATMPs, biosimilars, so all these products can apply for PSA. But in general, just as I mentioned in my presentation, I think what will be important is for you to define in terms of justify the interests for public health of your product. So all products that are, for instance, for rare diseases, pediatrics, unmet medical needs will be the main focus of our parallel scientific advice program. In addition to those ones, all the other ones that have, for one reason or the other, that have like complex development programs, and it can be like in terms of challenging questions from a clinical viewpoint, or then from a quality viewpoint. There have been a number of questions in terms of CMC, what can be covered or not. So everything that is like more innovation, for which guidelines are not yet there, will be really ideal candidates for PSA.
Wonderful. Thank you for responding to that first question. Looks like we have all 4 panelists right now on video. And we'll still keep with Anabela for the next question, the next few questions. And here's the next question. Which template should be used for briefing documents, the EMA or the FDA format?
Use the EMA format. So the sponsor will submit the briefing document to the EMA. The EMA will validate it, and once validated, the sponsor will then submit the final package using the EMA template to both agencies.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have another question for Anabela, and here's the next question. Will FDA still provide preliminary written comments or just final meeting minutes if the sponsor pursues the PSA process?
So we will have EMA and FDA will have a bilateral meeting where there will be exchanges between the assessors and the reviewers of the preliminary assessment from both agencies. And after their meeting, there will be preliminary comments sent to the sponsor that then the sponsor are supposed to address during the trilateral meeting.
Thank you for responding to that question. One more question for Anabela Marçal, and here is the final question. Can PSA be used for hybrid generic 505(b)(2) application?
Our PSA program. Back to September last year, we initiated a pilot of parallel scientific advice for complex generics. So these are also, so we have a specific program and the companies are welcome to request parallel scientific advice requests in this area or for this type of products.
Thank you for responding to that group of questions. We're going to move on to our next panelist, Commander Shannon Thor, and here is the first question for Commander Thor. The FDA email is different from the FDA ESG for IND. Does this mean a different review team will review and meet with the sponsor other than the IND review division?
Hi, yeah, thanks for that question. That's a very good question. So the answer is no. You are going to be working with the IND review division. So the request comes into Europe office. So Europe office manages the PSA program for FDA, and so we're responsible for routing that informal request to the appropriate division and working with them throughout the PSA procedure. But they will be kind of picking up the correspondence, and it will be tracked via the IND, and they'll be the review team in all of the meetings and writing the materials and giving the advice.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have another question from Commander Thor, and here it is. Why is PSA less popular in oncology compared to other FDA and
I'm not sure I would call it less popular. Oncology is one of our primary, you saw in my slides, I think that's 15% of the products for PSA in the last 5 years. I think oncology, though, does have a lot of other types of advice procedures that might be utilized by applicants instead of doing a parallel scientific advice. So that might be a reason why maybe, in your opinion, the percentage isn't as high as you might think it would be.
Thank you for responding to that question. I've got a couple more questions for Commander Thor, and here's the next question. How many of the products that went through PSA in 2020 were COVID products? And did COVID accelerate normal time?
So we haven't had any COVID products come for parallel scientific advice. And in fact, you'll see a lag in the data because typically, those 2020 procedures might have been accepted in 2019 and then went through the process in 2020. But PSA isn't a procedure that's been utilized for any COVID development as of yet. And I see Sandy wants to pick up on that.
Yes, thanks. I can pick up on that. I think, Shannon's exactly right. The timeline for the statistics that you saw predates the pandemic. But also, that's not to say that there weren't other ways that our two agencies were engaging on COVID. In fact, we've been engaging on COVID almost daily in every corner you could imagine, outside of formal procedures, without companies even asking us. We've been at the table on calls trying to understand each other's perspectives, because we really see the importance of the global picture of this pandemic, and that the needs in both of our regions are quite the same. So it's not a surprise to me that we haven't seen any particular formal requests for this.
Thank you for responding to that question. We're going to move on to our next panelist, Dr. Thorsten Vetter. And here is the first question for Dr. Vetter. Are tripartite meetings teleconferences or instead email communication?
Hello, good morning. Thank you very much for this question. In non-pandemic times, tripartite meetings are recommended to be in-person meetings, meaning that the sponsor or applicant has members of staff attending at both agencies, and the agencies and the meeting itself will then be led via a communication platform. So we hope we will soon be back to a hybrid format for trilateral meetings. Thank you.
Thank you for that, responding to that question. We've got another question for Dr. Vetter, and here's the question. And this is regarding case 1. Had this sponsor had previous single agency meetings prior to pursuing PSA?
Yes, this sponsor did have prior interactions, and I think my colleagues and myself have pointed out that, of course, prior interaction can facilitate PSA. But in particular for the EMA, it is not a requirement per se. So I think it is important to keep in mind that for EMA, we are open-minded to considering PSA requests, even if we did not have previous interactions, because our way of working is significantly different in this respect as compared to the FDA. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We're going to move on to Dr. Sandra Queter now for our next question. And this may be a group question based on the way it's phrased. Dr. Queter, is there a guidance from both agencies on what constitutes a sound briefing?
The materials on thanks for the question. The materials on the web page for this give some pretty good guidance on what constitutes a sound briefing book. But I think companies should really use common sense. When you ask a question, are you providing the right background for the agencies to be able to address your question? So for instance, in the way of scientific data that supports the plan that you are proposing. Are you leaving if you're leaving big gaps in your rationale, then you're putting yourself at a disadvantage, because we're going to come back to you with requests for more information, and there's a potential to delay things. So ask yourself, when you see your own briefing book, if I were new coming into this, would I be able to address these questions with the information that I have just provided here in the briefing book? So, and I think it's just as simple as that. Thorsten, do you have anything to add to that?
There is a template for the briefing document on the EMA website, which also gives some idea Of the background information, we of course expect depending on the area of advice that is requested. So clearly we would like to see for clinical studies protocol synopses or draft protocols so that our experts have something to review. But I think absolutely it's common sense approach. Thank you.
Yeah, and I will say, I'll add to that, keep in mind, one of the things that we just talked about was FDA does like it when they've seen the product in some form before, say, as a pre-IND or an IND. And so we will have seen things such as toxicology data, okay? But because EMA doesn't have INDs, they won't have seen previous toxicology data. So if you have a question about, say, starting dose or dose select, I would say preferably dose selection in a clinical trial, you need to be able to provide them with the appropriate background information to actually address that question. FDA may have it on file somewhere in an IND, but EMA does not. So keep those things in mind.
Because of these divergences in pre-information by the agencies, that we make sure that the level of information is appropriate to perform the parallel scientific advice.
Yeah, thank our panelists for responding to that question. We do have another question that came in for Dr. Queter, and here is the question. Does parallel scientific advice ever include additional regulatory authorities from other countries such as Health Canada, or allow for these authorities to listen in on calls?
That's a really interesting question. And this program exists between FDA and EMA. We have not had anyone ask to include another agency. I think if you're trying to get advice from more than two agencies at the same time, my opinion is that's an enormous extra load. If a company were to request another regulator to sit in, we would have to take that under advisement with the individual experts who are involved in the advice. I don't say that it's a definite nor a definite yes. I think we'd have to take it on a case-by-case basis. But I will say for us, these procedures are a lot of work logistically. It takes a lot to get the experts together to have the bilateral conversation. The more complicated you make it, the more difficult it's going to become. And I think may not be the best use of everyone's resources, at least at this time. Shannon, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just thought I'd add that though we haven't had other regulatory authorities but you were talking about other participants, and I thought I'd flag that we do sometimes invite patient representatives into the PSA procedures, and that's been very valuable.
And in the process.
Thanks to the panel for responding to that. We do have a question that seems to be addressed to all panelists, and we'll take this one at a time, starting with Dr. Queter. Would you please comment on how the lessons learned from PSA is or will be used for the two agencies to harmonize their guidance or position on development topics?
I think one of the things that PSAs do is they do highlight for us where we actually have alignment and where we don't. And if we already have alignment on things that highlights for us, well, maybe we need to be clearer on that in our individual guidances or guidelines so that it's evident to all. And if we have not yet decided on the basis of any of these procedures that, we need to write our guidances more clearly, or we need to do a shared guidance, but I don't know that we've had enough of them in any one product or clinical indication area to warrant that. But I think over time, it's only natural that we would, in revising our guidances, take our lessons from this into account.
Things that PSA does is sometimes introduce regulators to each other who perhaps hadn't met, and it sort of opens doors of communication going forward, and that in turn, opens us up for more harmonization in the future.
People have ever met each other. So this is good. This is good. And one of the important things about the bilateral is they get to start to talk about things. I would say what we find, though, is we often find in these processes that we are far more aligned than not. And sometimes the way our guidances are worded suggest that there's much more of a difference than there actually is. That's just been my personal observation. Thorsten, Anabela, I don't know what you think about that, but I'm always struck by our meetings when we come away, and that's what people think. And on its surface, initially, we thought we were going to be maybe very far apart because of something that's written, but when we actually get into the discussion of the individual product and the pathway, it's just that we focused on different things in our writings, but actually, we have the some very similar perspectives.
I would absolutely agree, Sandy, that is the case. And I see the contribution of PSA discussions to changes in guidance being incremental, really. I mean, they bring expert teams together, and very often the discussion does not end on the topic matter with the PSA. This is carried forward and leads to further discussions, and then maybe down the road, 2 years, 3 years later, can trigger a change in the guidance. So we find at EMA PSA discussions extremely helpful because it allows us for a very close and on a deep subject matter for an interaction with FDA experts, which informs our internal discussions then as well.
Perfect. Thanks for our panel for all responding to that. And we're going to go back to the beginning again with another question. Try to get one per panelist, and we'll see how this goes. The first one will be for Anabela Marçal. Is the advice received through PSA considered binding? For example, if the sponsor follows the advice received from PSA, would there be no pushback received during the review of the MAA?
The short answer is no. Of course, as we have mentioned during this session, PSA really is important for the companies to understand the points of convergence between the agencies, and as well as to have a better understanding why agencies could diverge in certain areas. But we need to think we are talking about its scientific advice. So basically we are advising companies, how to test the product, how to probably the best methodologies for clinical trials, the best endpoints for the indication in question. However, when it comes to marketing authorization application assessment, that's different. There we are looking at benefit risk. So we are looking at what came from the studies that were done. So there are other factors that come into place. So the fact that, both agencies are convergent, and the fact that you have good feedback in terms of parallel scientific advice and you follow all of it, it cannot be a guarantee that you will have, a positive marketing authorization. So it helps for sure. I think it will facilitate the review when it comes to that time.
but it's not a guarantee.
Thank you for responding to that question. We're going to move on to Commander Shannon Thor for the next question. And here's the question. With no convergence being guaranteed, can a sponsor at least hope for no contradictory either?
But it's the aim of parallel scientific advice to converge where possible. That's what we're doing it for. But I think it's equally important for the sponsor to understand if we aren't able to converge, the reasons why. And so we get together in the bilateral meeting and discuss those reasons and then provide the preliminary comments and the list of issues to the sponsor after that bilateral meeting. So they're able to see those reasons. They're able to prepare a presentation addressing them and proposing possible backup plans or new approaches for us to consider. So I think that it's as important for the sponsor to know where those differences are and be able to explore them through PSA.
The point is, if there is a divergence, for a company to know what that divergence is and know how so that the company can then take that information back and figure out how they're going to address their development program to meet the expectations in both regions. Where we can identify alignment, that's fantastic. We love it. Everyone loves it. But there are going to be cases when, for a variety of possible reasons, we just can't. And sometimes there's simply regulatory reasons or legal reasons in our regions that just exist.
Thank you for responding to that question. We're going to move on to Dr. Thorsten Vetter. We might have time for two questions. Here's the first question for Dr. Vetter. When is PSA beneficial, and when would it be best for separate meetings?
Divergencies in guidances or challenging new regulatory settings. There is an example, a classical example is where a medical device development is involved in the overall development program, because here still there are just really differences in terms of regulations in the US and EU. So this would usually not be an ideal candidate for parallel scientific advice. That being said, the situation is changing in the EU regulations, so we would welcome requests, and this will then be a case-by-case decision-making at the time of the PSA request letter. In terms of timing, I saw there were also questions of timing. At what stage of development is it ideal to submit a parallel scientific advice? And while it really can be requested at any stage if there is a reason and a good rationale, scientific rationale to do this, maybe the post-phase 2 is an ideal time point, because their quality and non-clinical development are sufficiently mature and there is already some clinical data, and it is about the planning of the all-critical phase 3 program. So this is kind of the natural sweet spot that we see where there is a successful PSA request. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We're going to try to squeeze in one last question, and we'll bring Dr. Sandra Queter back on board for this final question. Is it okay to bring our consultants to participate in the trilateral
engaged in the discussion. And you can bring to the table whoever you like. And if you have someone that you think can contribute, it's better for them to listen and be part of the conversation than to have it translated later. But that's up to you and your consultant. But we think it's absolutely a good idea.
Well, that's all the time we have for questions. We want to have a huge thank you to our speakers for your very informative and timely talk, and also for responding to numerous questions that came in. We do have a few closing reminders. This activity is eligible for an attendance certificate which supports continuing education by SOCA, RAPS, SQA, and ACRP. Please refer to our website at fda.gov/CEDAR-SBIA for more details. You'll be able to obtain the attendance certificate only upon completion of the survey, which will remain open for 2 weeks. And remember, that's March the 30th. Please remember to download the certificates immediately upon completing the survey. It cannot be retrieved after the fact. Let us know your comments and feedback via the survey. This will help guide the design of our future events. Additional tutorials are available through fda.gov/CEDARLearn. Also, to summarize, for our physicians, pharmacists, and nurses claiming the 1.5 continuing education credits, attendees have 14 days from the last day of the activity to log in, complete the required CE evaluations, and attest to attendance to claim credit. So be sure to complete the CE session evaluation on or before March the 30th. For those who wish to receive a certificate of attendance, we'll send a webinar survey evaluation link following this webinar. When an attendee completes the survey evaluation, they can also download a certificate of attendance, which can be used to support RAPS, SOCRA, ACRP, and SQA credits. Again, the survey link will close in 14 days, and that's March the 30th. To simplify things, the thank you email we sent to attendees later today will have information on both the CE claim code and the survey link. On behalf of Cedar Small Business and Industry Assistance, we hope you enjoyed today's presentation and found it helpful. We look forward to your presence at future webinars, which will be advertised on our website at fda.gov/CEDAR-SBIA. Thank you.